What would you do if your daughter was silenced at an International Women's Day ceremony for the way she was dressed? I'm not asking hypothetically. I'm asking because it happened to mine. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. They said the event was about empowering girls. Big banners. Soft lighting. Corporate sponsors smiling for photos. A stage framed in purple and gold with the words, "Empower the Next Generation," glowing behind the podium. My 16-year-old daughter, Leyland Denge, stood there in a navy blue, knee-length dress with long sleeves and a high neckline. The kind of dress you'd wear to church, or a scholarship interview, or to meet your future in-laws. She was halfway through her speech. And then a staff member walked up and took the microphone out of her hand. The room went silent. Not awkward silent. Not confused silent. Frozen silent. "Her dress isn't appropriate," he said. 300 people. Corporate executives. Teachers. Parents. Students. Local media. Live stream cameras. And my daughter, mid-sentence, was cut off at an event meant to celebrate young women finding their voices. Let me ask you something. If this was about empowerment, why did they silence a girl for speaking? I'm Dr. Amaran Denge. I'm 42. A public health researcher. A single mother for the last 13 years. I've sat in boardrooms. I've testified at panels. I know how institutions operate when they feel threatened. And in that moment, I didn't argue. I didn't stand up. I didn't shout. I sent one text. But I'll come back to that. First, you need to understand what that day meant to Layla. She had worked for weeks on that speech. Practiced it in our living room. Timed her pauses. Rewrote her closing line at least 7 times. Her topic was redefining power in young women. She spoke about being the only girl in her school's robotics club. About teachers who assumed boys would handle the technical builds. About confidence not being something you're born with, but something you practice. She wasn't angry in her speech. She was sharp, measured, brilliant. And she earned that podium. Bright Futures Initiative, the nonprofit hosting the event, had selected her as one of 3 youth speakers. They even posted her photo on their website the week before. Future Leader Spotlight, they called it. So what changed? Was it really about a dress? Because here's what's strange. There was no published dress code. No pre-event email about standards. No warning backstage. Layla had checked in, received her name badge, and was complimented twice before stepping on stage. Then suddenly, mid-speech, she was inappropriate. The staff member who took the mic was Roland Pierce. 54 years old. Event coordinator. Polished. Controlled. The type of man who speaks in PR-approved sentences. He leaned toward the host, Vanessa Clark, 38, local TV personality. Whispered something, and she stiffened. Then he walked up. I saw it unfolding before it happened. You know that feeling? When the air shifts. When something invisible changes in a room. Layla was explaining how girls in leadership are often labeled bossy, while boys are called confident. And that's when Roland stepped in. He didn't look at her when he took the mic. He addressed the room. We need to maintain standards at this event. Standards. Interesting word. Layla stood there, hands empty, blinking against stage lights that suddenly felt harsher. I felt heat rise in my chest. But I stayed seated. Why? Because I had already noticed something Roland hadn't. In the front row sat a man without a name tag. 47. Dark suit. Watching carefully. Calm. Daniel Reed. Most people in that room didn't recognize him. I did. And so did Roland, though not immediately. Daniel Reed was the Chief Compliance Officer of Northbridge Holdings, the primary corporate sponsor funding more than half of Bright Futures Initiative's annual budget. And when I saw him glance down at his phone, I knew something Roland didn't. I typed 3 words. Now would help. And I pressed send. Across the room, Daniel's phone lit up. He read the message, looked up at me, gave the smallest nod. Meanwhile, on stage, my daughter was still standing there. 16 years old. Humiliated in front of cameras. In a dress that covered more skin than half the room. Tell me, what message were they sending? That empowerment has conditions? That girls can speak, but only within boundaries approved by men? Roland reached toward Layla's arm as if to guide her off stage. That's when the man in the front row slowly stood up. And the energy in the room shifted again. Vanessa froze. Roland turned. And for the first time that evening, he looked uncertain. They said it was inappropriate. But no one could explain why. That line kept replaying in my head as Layla stood frozen on the stage. The room was suffocating with silence, the kind that presses against your chest and makes it hard to breathe. 300 eyes on a 16-year-old girl who had done nothing wrong but speak her truth. Layla's speech had started strong. Her voice clear, confident, full of conviction. She described being the only girl in her high school robotics club, recounting the times she'd been overlooked for tasks that teachers automatically assumed the boys could handle. She spoke of statistics of women underrepresented in STEM fields, of confidence gaps that start in middle school and follow girls into adulthood. She even shared her own story about the first time she built a robot entirely on her own, and the surprise on everyone's faces when it worked flawlessly. She was building momentum, connecting with the audience. Her words weren't just informative, they were inspiring. And then Roland Pierce walked up. Roland was 54, with neatly combed hair and an aura of authority that came from decades in event management. He didn't hesitate. He didn't whisper. He took the microphone from Layla's hand, and in that same polished, commanding voice he said, "Her dress isn't appropriate." I swear the sound echoed in my ears. The words seemed to linger in the room longer than they should have, a deliberate intrusion into a space that was meant to uplift young women. And then came the silence. Not just the silence of surprise, but the silence of judgment, of everyone suddenly aware that a girl had been publicly judged and stopped mid-sentence. The parents shifted in their seats. Some students whispered. Phones were raised, cameras pointed, recording this strange intersection of empowerment and authority collapsing into confusion. Vanessa Clark, the host, froze like a deer in headlights, unsure whether to intervene or ignore. Layla didn't move. She looked at the mic. She looked at the audience. Her hands trembled slightly, and I could see her trying to process whether to walk off stage or keep standing. And then my eyes found the man in the front row. Daniel Reed. 47 years old, dark suit, calm posture, the type of man who gives the impression that he notices everything, even the things you think are invisible. He didn't immediately speak. He didn't stand. But there was a tension in the way he shifted slightly in his chair. He was watching, calculating. I stayed seated. I didn't confront Roland. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I had learned long ago that moments like these are rarely solved with confrontation. Sometimes the most powerful actions are invisible. I sent a text. 3 simple words. Nothing more. And watched as the first ripple of change passed across the room. Meanwhile, Layla's mind was racing. Did she deserve this? Was she wrong for wearing the dress? Did she misstep somewhere? 16 years old. Trying her best. Already navigating a world where women's voices are constantly measured against invisible standards. And now, at an event meant to celebrate girls like her, she was being policed for her appearance. The irony wasn't lost on anyone who understood the stakes. Here she was, speaking about empowerment, and, suddenly, the entire message was undermined by the actions of one man who decided that a dress dictated credibility. Roland leaned slightly closer to Vanessa, whispering something that sent her head nodding almost imperceptibly. The room held its collective breath. Parents, sponsors, teachers. All unsure what would happen next. And all of us watching, wondering if a young girl's voice would be snuffed out simply because someone decided it didn't fit the mold. Layla's hands fidgeted at her sides. Her eyes scanned the crowd. The cameras were rolling, and I could see the tension building. But just as it seemed like she might step down, Daniel Reed shifted. A small movement. A nod. A presence that seemed to ripple across the room without a word. And then, almost imperceptibly at first, other students began to whisper, subtly, supportively. 1 or 2 parents leaned forward, sensing that the situation was not as simple as it appeared. Phones were raised, but this time not just to record, but to witness, to stand silently alongside a young girl who had been wronged. Roland reached for her arm as if to escort her off stage. But Daniel Reed, still seated, moved slightly forward. It was quiet, calm, deliberate. The tension shifted again. The balance of power, previously assumed, began to wobble. And in that moment, I knew that what seemed like the end, the humiliation, the silencing, was actually just the beginning. Because the man in the front row, who had been watching quietly, was about to change everything. Roland thought he controlled the room. He didn't realize who was sitting in it. That's when Daniel Reed, still calm, finally spoke. Not loudly, not angrily, just clear, measured. "Can someone explain the dress code violation?" The room went still again, but this silence was different. This was the silence of accountability. Roland's confident posture faltered. Vanessa Clark, the host, swallowed hard. She was no longer in control. The audience sensed it too. They were waiting for an answer that wouldn't come. Daniel wasn't a random attendee. He was the Chief Compliance Officer of Northbridge Holdings, the largest sponsor of the Bright Futures Initiative, the organization hosting this very event. More than 60% of the program's annual budget came from his company. Suddenly, Roland's mic grab looked less like authority and more like reckless misjudgment. We just want to maintain the spirit of the event," Vanessa said, her voice a little too high, too nervous. Daniel's gaze didn't waver. "And silencing a student does that?" The words hit like ice water. The audience shifted. Parents glanced at each other. Students straightened. Phones moved from casual recording to capturing evidence. Corporate sponsors exchanged looks. Someone in the back whispered, "This is going online." Meanwhile, Layla was still on stage. 16, standing tall despite the tremor in her hands. She had been cut off, humiliated, exposed in front of everyone, and yet, she didn't cry. Not yet. She didn't run. Her eyes found mine, and I gave her the smallest nod of reassurance. "It's okay," I mouthed. "You're not alone." Daniel continued, calm but firm. "Return the microphone." Roland hesitated. He opened his mouth, looked around, clearly calculating the consequences. He realized, finally, that this wasn't just about a dress anymore. It was about compliance, policy, reputation, funding, legal risk. And someone who could pull all those levers quietly, without raising his voice, had just decided he was watching. Slowly, Roland handed the mic back. The tension in the room shifted again. Layla exhaled audibly and resumed her speech. But this time, something changed in her delivery. She added an unscripted line, "Empowerment isn't selective." Applause erupted. And this time it was louder, more heartfelt. It wasn't just polite. It was recognition. Recognition that she had been wronged and had reclaimed her voice. Phones waved in the air. Videos streamed. The whispers of support became audible cheers. Meanwhile, a journalist in the audience, Maya Chin, a 34-year-old investigative reporter, began taking notes. Her phone tapped as she tweeted snippets, capturing the story before anyone else could spin it. Within minutes, the first social media clips appeared. "Teen silenced mid-speech at Women's Day event" trended quietly in the local online community. Roland tried to regain control. He whispered to Vanessa, perhaps hoping she could smooth things over. Daniel leaned back slightly, calm, unflinching. The subtle power play was clear. One wrong move, and Roland's authority, carefully constructed for years, could collapse in an instant. Layla's speech now carried a new energy. She spoke not just of statistics, not just of personal anecdotes, but of courage, resilience, and the quiet power of holding your ground. She wasn't just speaking, she was making history in that moment. And the audience could feel it. Students leaned forward. Parents nodded. Sponsors whispered urgently to their colleagues. Daniel Reed sat, observing, calculating, making no overt move. The room had shifted from embarrassment and authority to accountability and witnessing. By the time she concluded, the applause was thunderous. Phones recorded, cameras captured, journalists typed. What had been a humiliating interruption had transformed into a public victory. But just as the room began to settle, Daniel's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, reading the message I had sent earlier. That small, deliberate text had been timed perfectly. Without me raising my voice or confronting Roland, the tide had turned. My daughter's voice, silenced for a moment, now resonated louder than it ever could have. Yet the resolution was far from complete. Behind the scenes, the implications were stacking. Northbridge Holdings now had leverage. Roland had made a misstep. Bright Futures initiative faced internal and public scrutiny. Vanessa Clark, though poised on camera, now had to navigate a room that no longer feared her direction. And in the audience, whispers grew. What had just happened wasn't just a dress issue. It was a power play witnessed live. It was a subtle reshaping of authority in real time. And the consequences for those who tried to silence a young girl would come quietly, but inevitably. But what happened after the applause is what almost cost them everything. They thought it was a wardrobe issue. It wasn't. Not really. The truth hit me only after the initial chaos settled. Bright Futures Initiative had signed a new anti-discrimination policy 2 months prior, a clause that specifically forbade appearance-based bias in youth programs. Roland had approved it himself. He had read it. He had signed off. And yet here he was, enforcing a rule that didn't exist in any official sense, in the most humiliating way possible, in front of cameras, parents, and students. Meanwhile, Daniel Reed, quiet but exacting, had already begun his behind-the-scenes work. He pulled out his phone and started documenting the incident. Compliance rules weren't just words on paper to him, they were leverage, accountability, and legal protection. A live stream of the event now existed as evidence. Everything had been recorded, and Daniel knew exactly how to use it. Maya Chin, the freelance journalist, was already tweeting clips. She titled her posts, "Teen Silenced at Women's Day Event Over Inappropriate Dress, Sponsor Steps In." Comments and shares began multiplying. Within an hour, local forums were buzzing. Parents of other students were outraged. Students were furious. And Roland? He had no idea how fast this was escalating. Layla, however, handled herself with an astonishing calm for a 16-year-old. She finished her speech. She received the applause. She felt the rush of vindication as Daniel's subtle intervention validated her right to speak. But behind the applause, she processed the deeper lesson: power doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers quietly in the right ear, in the right way, at the right moment. Later that evening, the board of Bright Futures convened an emergency meeting. Roland tried to frame it as a misunderstanding, claiming miscommunication. Vanessa distanced herself, claiming she froze because she wasn't aware of protocol. But Daniel's documentation, the live stream, the tweets, the internal notes, painted a different picture entirely. Emails were sent. Discussions began. Decisions loomed. Meanwhile, I did nothing publicly. I didn't call the press. I didn't march onto the stage. I forwarded the live stream clip to a local youth advocacy group, ensuring that Layla's story would be heard and protected. I scheduled a meeting with her school principal, making sure that my daughter felt supported, not just in the moment, but in the aftermath. Layla struggled with conflicting emotions: embarrassment, anger, shame, then empowerment. She realized she hadn't done anything wrong, that her voice mattered, and that the world sometimes tests you to see whether you'll back down. She had passed that test. The next day, Daniel Reed privately informed the board that the incident would trigger a formal review. Funding could be suspended pending the outcome. Roland's role was under scrutiny. And Vanessa Clark, though publicly calm, now privately recognized that her hesitation had almost cost the credibility of the entire event. By the third day, the formal apology arrived. Carefully worded. Polite. Avoiding the words discrimination or humiliation. Signed by the board of Bright Futures. I read it and set it aside. It was insufficient. Empty. Superficial. But it wasn't necessary. The real impact had already taken place. Layla had learned that even when adults falter, Allies exist, sometimes in the quietest corners, sometimes in the front row of a room full of witnesses. The social media response intensified. Clips went viral. People started sharing their own experiences of being silenced, misunderstood, or judged unfairly for arbitrary reasons. The narrative shifted. This wasn't just about a dress. This was about authority, accountability, and the courage of young women who refused to be minimized. The final twist came quietly, almost as an afterthought. Northbridge Holdings formally suspended 2 secondary sponsorships for the following quarter, citing concerns over compliance and governance. Rowland was removed from event coordination duties indefinitely. Vanessa Clark issued a public statement, vague but conciliatory. And Daniel Reed? He offered mentorship opportunities for Layla, recognizing her talent and bravery in navigating this ordeal at such a young age. But for all the external resolutions, the most important moment was between us, my daughter and I. I explained to Layla that the text I sent, the one that shifted the balance of power, wasn't about confrontation. It was about strategy. About using knowledge, timing, and the right people to achieve justice quietly but effectively. Layla nodded, absorbing the lesson. She kept her dress. She wore it again at her next debate event. And this time, every eye in the room respected her presence, not her wardrobe. The final reflection settled in my chest. Silence can be a tool. Patience can be a weapon. Strategy can move mountains, or at least shift the power dynamic in a crowded hall. And sometimes, the right ally in the right seat can make all the difference. The apology letter arrived in my inbox 3 days later. Polite, formal, careful. Avoided the words discrimination or humiliation. Brushed over the fact that a 16-year-old girl had been publicly silenced at an event that claimed to celebrate young women. It read like a script written to protect reputations rather than acknowledge wrongdoing. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The real victory had already happened. Layla had spoken. She had been witnessed. And the balance of power had shifted quietly but decisively, without a single public confrontation. Maya Chin, the journalist in the audience, published her story the next morning. Headline: Teen silenced at Women's Day event over appropriate dress, sponsor intervenes. The article quickly circulated across local news and social media. Clips of the incident trended, the comments pouring in from parents, students, and advocates for youth empowerment. It wasn't just a story about a dress anymore. It was about accountability, about authority being questioned, about the courage of a young woman standing up in the quietest, most unexpected way. Bright Futures Initiative felt the impact almost immediately. 2 secondary sponsors withdrew support, citing concerns about governance and risk management. The board convened emergency meetings, now forced to confront the systemic flaws that had allowed this to happen. Roland Pierce's authority evaporated as the board began formal proceedings to remove him from event coordination duties indefinitely. Vanessa Clark, the host, issued a public statement carefully worded to avoid blame, but acknowledging that lessons had been learned. Layla, for her part, didn't just survive the ordeal, she thrived. She received a private invitation from Daniel Reed for mentorship opportunities. An internship pathway with Northbridge Holdings opened up, designed to nurture her leadership potential. More importantly, she understood that power doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it whispers, quietly observing, then intervening at the exact right moment. We reflected on that day at home. I explained to Layla that my single text, the one that shifted the tide, was never about confrontation or anger. It was about strategy, about timing, about knowing which levers to pull without creating unnecessary conflict. It was a lesson in power, yes, but also in patience and observation. Layla nodded, understanding far more than her 16 years might suggest. She decided to keep the dress. She wore it again at her next debate competition. This time, no one tried to police her presence. The same navy blue dress became a symbol, not of the humiliation she endured, but of resilience, strength, and the subtle power of standing firm in one's truth. And yet, even after the visible outcomes, the social media attention, the board reshuffling, the mentorship opportunities, the real victory was quiet. It was in the moments of reflection, in the understanding that silence, patience, and precise action can sometimes achieve more than loud confrontation. In the lesson that power is not always about volume, it's often about position, timing, and the courage to act when it matters most. 3 days later, Vanessa Clark approached me privately. She admitted she had frozen on stage, feared losing control, and regretted not stepping in. It was a small acknowledgement, but meaningful. Even those in positions of public authority could be human, could falter, and could learn. Looking back, I realized that the event had offered 3 simultaneous lessons, one for Layla, one for me, and one for everyone watching. Layla learned that standing up for yourself, even silently, carries weight. I learned that guiding, observing, and acting strategically often yields more results than confrontation. And the audience, both in the room and online, witnessed that real empowerment isn't about words on banners or ceremonial speeches. It's about holding everyone accountable to the standards they claim to uphold. Layla's final reflection on the incident stayed with me. "Mom, they tried to stop me, but they gave me a bigger stage instead." She was right. A single act of quiet observation, a timely intervention, and the courage to persist transformed what could have been a humiliating moment into a defining one. Her speech became a rallying point, her story circulated widely, and her confidence, sharpened by adversity, grew stronger. So, to anyone watching, what would you do if someone tried to silence the truth? Would you shout? Would you argue? Or would you wait, observe, and act strategically? Because sometimes, one precise action can change everything. One text, one step, one voice. They tried to stop a 16-year-old girl from speaking. Instead, they gave her a bigger stage. And the lesson. The real lesson is that empowerment is not a slogan. It's accountability, strategy, and courage combined.